The year was 1951, and the United States was on the verge of a cultural revolution that no one saw coming. It wasn't led by a politician or an artist, but by a small, flickering box in the corner of every American living room, the television. For the first time in history, the government had the power to bring the theater of justice directly into the homes of 30 million people. And they had a specific target in mind. They wanted to drag the Prime Minister of the underworld, Frank Costello, out of the shadows and strip away the myth of his invincibility. Senator Estes Kefauver, a man with presidential ambitions and a flair for the dramatic, had organized a special committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce. He didn't just want a legal conviction, he wanted a public execution of Costello's reputation. When the subpoenas were served, the underworld held its breath. Most mob bosses handled these situations in one of two ways: they either fled to a country with no extradition, or they sat in the witness chair and took the Fifth Amendment, repeating the same mechanical phrase, "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may incriminate me," until the cameras grew bored. But Frank Costello was not most bosses. He understood that the television was not just a recording device, it was a weapon of mass perception. He knew that if he remained silent, he looked guilty. If he spoke and lied, he went to prison for perjury. And if he told the truth, he signed his own death warrant. He was trapped in a box of light and sound, with the entire world waiting to see the face of the man who supposedly owned New York. As Costello walked into the hearing room in Manhattan's federal courthouse, the air was thick with the heat of 1,000 studio lights and the nervous energy of hundreds of reporters. The cameras were positioned to capture every sweat drop, every nervous twitch, and every flicker of fear in his eyes. Senator Kefauver sat on his high bench, looking down like a vengeful god, ready to unmask the devil. But just as the red light on the cameras blinked to life, Costello's lead attorney, the brilliant George Wolfe, stood up and dropped a legal bombshell that would change the course of media history. He argued that his client was being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment by being forced to perform like an actor in a movie. He made a demand that silenced the room: "My client will testify. But you will not show his face." Not once. The senators were stunned. The television producers panicked. After a heated, whispered debate, a bizarre compromise was reached. The cameras would stay on, but they were forbidden from tilting up past Costello's shoulders. For the next several days, the American public would witness something they had never seen before and would never see again. They would not see the Prime Minister's face, but they would see his hands. Every finger movement, every clenched fist, and every trembling reach for a glass of water would be broadcast in high-contrast black and white to 30 million homes. It was a visual symphony of anxiety and power. Before we dive into the psychological warfare that took place between those microphones, and how Costello used the visual silence of his face to turn the entire American public against the senators who were trying to destroy him, you need to understand the stakes of this move. This wasn't just a legal trick, it was the birth of modern media manipulation. Frank Costello understood that the imagination of the public is far more dangerous than the reality of a face. If you want to learn how to control the narrative when the world is trying to tear you down, and how to use your silence as a shield, then you are watching the right channel. Hit that subscribe button right now to join a community that studies the invisible levers of power. Give this video a like if you believe that the smartest person in the room is often the one who says the least. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type the word anonymous in all caps. Let's see who understands that true power doesn't need a spotlight. Now, let's go back to that hearing room, where Frank Costello was about to turn his hands into the most famous actors in America. The spectacle was hypnotic. Because the viewers couldn't see Costello's eyes, they became obsessed with his hands. They watched as his manicured fingers rhythmically drummed on the wooden table. They watched him nervously shred a small piece of paper into tiny, confetti-like squares. They watched the way he gripped his expensive silk handkerchief when the questions about his political connections grew too pointed. To the senators, these were signs of a guilty man breaking under pressure. But to the 30 million people watching at home, something strange began to happen. They began to feel a bizarre sense of intimacy with the man. By hiding his face, Costello had made himself a blank canvas upon which every American could project their own feelings. Costello's voice, a raspy, gravelly whisper, the result of a botched throat surgery years earlier, added to the mystique. While the senators boomed with self-righteous authority, Costello's voice was low, calm, and hauntingly vulnerable. He didn't sound like a monster, he sounded like a tired, aging businessman being bullied by a group of loudmouthed politicians. He was using a technique that psychologists now call the power of the partial reveal. By giving the audience only a piece of himself, he forced them to fill in the rest with their own imagination, and the imagination is almost always kinder than the truth. As the questioning intensified, Senator Kefauver leaned in for the kill. He began listing the names of judges, police commissioners, and district leaders who were allegedly on Costello's payroll. "Mr. Costello," the senator barked, "is it not true that you held the keys to Tammany Hall? Is it not true that no man could be elected in this city without your blessing?" The cameras zoomed in on Costello's hands. They were perfectly still. For 10 long seconds, there was no movement. The tension was so thick it felt like it would shatter the glass on the television screens. Then, slowly, Costello reached for a glass of water. His hand didn't shake. He took a slow, deliberate sip, set the glass down with a soft clack, and whispered into the microphone, "I am just a man who has made many friends." Is friendship now a crime in the United States? The room erupted. The senators were furious at his evasiveness, but the public was fascinated. The hands of Costello became a national obsession. People began to write letters to the committee, not calling for Costello's head, but complaining about the rudeness of the senators. They felt that the committee was being unfair to this quiet, dignified man who clearly just wanted to be left alone. Costello had achieved the impossible. He had turned a criminal investigation into a popularity contest, and he was winning because he was the only one in the room who understood the psychology of the new media. Behind the scenes, Costello's strategy was even deeper. He knew that if he showed his face, his expressions would be analyzed by every law enforcement agency in the country. They would look for the micro-expressions of guilt when certain names were mentioned. By refusing the camera, he denied them that data. He was effectively blindfolding the law while they tried to walk him to the gallows. He was also protecting his family. He knew that his wife and children would have to walk the streets of New York, and he didn't want his criminal face burned into the collective memory of the city. Even in his moment of greatest peril, he was thinking about the long-term branding of the Costello name, but as the hearings dragged into their second week, the pressure began to take a physical toll. Costello's hands, which had been so stoic, began to show signs of genuine distress. He started to wring them together until his knuckles turned white. He would pick at the skin around his fingernails until they bled. The viewers saw this and, instead of seeing guilt, they saw a man being driven to a nervous breakdown by an oppressive government. The victim narrative was taking hold. Costello was no longer the prime minister of the underworld, he was that underdog of the airwaves. Senator Kefauver, sensing that he was losing the psychological war, decided to change tactics. He stopped asking about crime and started asking about Costello's character. "What have you done for your country, Mr. Costello?" he asked with a sneer. Costello paused. His hands relaxed for the first time in hours. He leaned toward the microphone and gave an answer that would go down in history: "I paid my taxes." It was a brilliant, simple, and relatable answer. Every American watching struggled with taxes. By framing his contribution to society in the same way a plumber or a teacher would, he bridged the gap between the mobster and the citizen. However, the government had one final card to play. They had found a witness, a former associate who was willing to testify that Costello had personally ordered the corruption of the New York State Supreme Court. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the evidence that would bypass the hand show and put Costello in a cage for life. The witness was being flown in under heavy guard, and the atmosphere in the hearing room shifted from curiosity to a predatory hunger. The senators looked at Costello's hands, expecting them to tremble with the fear of a man who knew the end was near. But instead, Costello's hands did something that no one expected. They stopped moving altogether. He sat in total, icy stillness, waiting for the one man who could destroy him to walk through the door. Costello knew that this witness was a gambler, a man with a heavy debt to a certain social club in New Jersey. Even from the witness chair, even with the cameras rolling, Costello was sending a message. He wasn't using words. He was using the silence of his hands to tell the witness exactly what would happen if he opened his mouth. The entire fate of the national crime syndicate was hanging by a thread, and that thread was being held by a pair of hands that hadn't moved an inch in 20 minutes. The witness, a man named Willie Moretti, was a high-ranking member of the North Jersey underworld and a longtime associate of Costello. But Moretti was a man whose mind was starting to fray, a victim of advanced syphilis that made him talkative and unpredictable, a deadly combination in a world built on silence. The senators believed that Moretti's loose tongue would finally provide the verbal evidence needed to match the visual tension in the room. As Moretti took the stand, he glanced over at the table where Costello sat today. He couldn't see Costello's face, but he saw those hands, still, ivory-colored, and poised like a predator waiting in tall grass. The witness fumbled with his collar, his eyes darting toward the cameras. He knew that even if the world couldn't see the Prime Minister's eyes, those eyes were burned into his soul. The questioning began, but instead of the damning testimony the committee expected, the room was treated to a masterclass in psychological paralysis. Moretti, usually a man of 1,000 words, began to stutter. He looked at Costello's hands, which had slowly moved to grip the edge of the mahogany table. To the casual observer, it looked like a man seeking stability. To Moretti, it was a signal of the noose tightening. Every time Moretti moved toward a sensitive topic, the payoffs, the judges, the secret meetings at the Waldorf, Costello's fingers would tap a rhythmic, slow beat. 1, 2, 3. It was the tempo of a funeral march. The witness's testimony became a chaotic mess of I don't recalls and I might have been mistaken. The senators were livid. They had brought the entire weight of the federal government to bear on this one moment, and it was evaporating in the heat of the television lights. They turned back to Costello, their voices rising in a frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative. But the Prime Minister had one more move in his repertoire, a move that would effectively end the hearing and cement his legend as the man who broke the medium of television. Costello's lawyer stood up and announced that his client was suffering from a severe case of laryngitis and acute nervous exhaustion. He claimed that the bright lights and the relentless questioning were literally killing the man. Costello, leaning into the microphone, let out a cough that sounded like dry leaves scraping on a tombstone. It was a sound of such profound frailty that the millions of people watching at home felt a collective surge of pity. This wasn't the boogeyman of Brooklyn, this was a sick, elderly man being hounded by the state. Then, in a move that shocked the legal world, Costello simply stood up. Without the committee's permission, without a closing statement, he turned his back on the cameras and walked out of the room. The cameras, still restricted by the no-face rule, could only capture his back and his hands as they swung at his sides. It was the most dramatic exit in the history of American justice. By walking out, he wasn't just leaving a courtroom, he was walking out of a trap that had been designed to hold him for the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath was a media firestorm. The Kefauver hearings had intended to show the power of the government over the mob. But they had accidentally shown the power of an individual over the system. In the weeks that followed, the Costello hands became a cultural phenomenon. People in bars across America began to imitate his rhythmic tapping. Comedians on late-night radio did bits about the man with no face. But beneath the surface of the pop culture obsession, a much more significant shift had occurred. Frank Costello had successfully humanized the underworld. He had made the public feel that the real criminals weren't the men in the silk suits, but the politicians in the high chairs who used the law as a stage for their own ambitions. The government tried to strike back, citing Costello for contempt of Congress. They eventually sentenced him to 18 months in prison for his walkout, but to Costello, this was a small price to pay. He had traded a year of his life for 20 years of his reputation. By refusing to be unmasked, he kept the mystery of his power intact. When he eventually went to prison, he went not as a defeated gangster, but as a martyr for privacies and dignity. He had effectively won the television war by refusing to play by its rules. Years later, historians would point to the Kefauver hearings as the moment the American public lost its innocence regarding the government. They saw the desperation of the senators and the quiet, calculated grace of the Prime Minister. Costello had understood something that his rivals, like Al Capone or Albert Anastasia, never could, that in the modern world, your image is your currency. If you let the world see too much of you, they lose their fear. If you let them see nothing, they lose their interest. But if you show them just your hands, you own their imagination forever. The Prime Minister lived another 22 years after that day in the courthouse. He survived assassination attempts, tax trials, and the rise of a younger, more violent generation of mobsters. He died in 1973, in a quiet hospital bed, having lived long enough to see the very men who tried to unmask him on television fall into political obscurity. He remained the only man who could sit in a room with the most powerful people in the world and make them feel like they were the ones on trial. He proved that true authority doesn't need a loud voice or a visible face. It only needs the patience to wait for the cameras to turn on, the discipline to keep its secrets, and the brilliance to know that sometimes a pair of hands on a table can tell a story more powerful than 1,000 witnesses. Frank Costello didn't just survive the age of television, he mastered it, leaving behind a blueprint for every strategist who knows that the most powerful move you can make is the one the world never sees coming. As the credits rolled on the 1951 hearings, the senators realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had invited a shark into their aquarium, thinking they had the glass to protect them. They didn't realize that the shark didn't need to break the glass, he just needed to make everyone look at the reflection instead of the predator. Frank Costello walked away into the Manhattan fog, a man who had been seen by millions, yet known by no one. If this deep dive into the psychological mastery of the Prime Minister inspired you to look at the world differently, then you are ready for what's next. We are just beginning to peel back the layers of history's most guarded secrets. You now understand that in the game of perception, what you hide is often more important than what you show. Give this video a like if you agree that the quietest man in the room is usually the one holding the deck. If you want to master the art of the invisible player and see how other legendary figures controlled the world from the shadows, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We are building a community of thinkers who aren't afraid to look past the surface. Now, I want to hear from you. In an age where everyone is trying to be seen, do you think Frank Costello's no-face strategy would still work today? Or has the world changed too much for silence to be a weapon? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your insights are what keep this channel moving forward. Stay sharp, stay strategic. And always remember, the best move is the one you never have to explain. We'll see you in the next story.